Famcast Media Podcast Network. Famcast Media Podcast Network.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, persons of all ages, welcome to the most exclusive group in the wrestling community. And now, your hosts, first, from Oaxaca, Puerto Rico, Macho Rodriguez! And his tag team partner from New Brunswick, Canada, Rican, Tyler,
¿Cómo estamos, mi gente? Welcome to another edition of Must Love Wrestling, and we have a very special guest today, the Professor, Fernando Uribe. What's going on, my guy? How you doing?
Miss you guys. I gotta tell you, that intro is as lit as I've ever seen it on a pro wrestling podcast. I gotta tell you, congrats on that one, fellas. That's really well done.
Oh man, that's all D. That's D Rotten. He's the producer. He does all that stuff. He has the brand new intro for Famcast Media, so good on him too. So Fernando, what have you been up to? This is your return to the wrestling circuit. You haven't done a show since your very last Work in the Marks podcast.
Man, I've just been busy. You know, it's election season. Been helping out with some campaigns, and also my show on Monday nights, as you can see behind me on the Jersey First Television Network, has been really, really growing. We've been averaging about 10,000 views all organically a week. We've been peaking over the summer at 25,000 views. We've been consistent, really keeping it around 13, 14, almost 15,000 views a week in what I'm doing with Real Talk via Jersey First TV. So it's interviewing candidates, elected officials, journalists, activists, people. It's resonating in New Jersey. So that's keeping me busy. I got another big project coming up in 2025 with the Jersey First Television Network. And again, man, politics never takes a break with me, and it keeps me busy with content.
No, man, that's cool. It's really good to hear. It's good to know that your show's doing really well. I see that you post. I follow your Instagram stories, and I see that you post a lot about your views and stuff, and they're all organic, and that's awesome. Hopefully, you could send some of those views over to us. Maybe you'll rub some elbows with us here, and you'll get us some more views.
You gotta tell me what the link is for. I'll share it right now, brother. You just gotta tell me.
Perfect. I'll send that over to you. Yeah. Tyler, man, Mr. the Canadian Nightmare, the talent. How you been, brother?
Things are good.
No floods, no nothing. Let's remind the people that Tyler lives in Florida, so he did have to deal with Helene down there. So did she slap you around? Did she use a ball chain? Like, was it good?
She's just a couple of little backhands, nothing serious.
Nothing serious. All right.
Yeah,
you're all good down there.
Right. Yeah, didn't even lose power here.
Oh, okay.
It definitely went out where I work, but we didn't even miss a day. So,
well, that's cool. I know I was talking to you. You said you were really worried, so you wanted to keep all your stuff charged for the moment.
Thursday night was a little rough.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But so guys, to steal a line from the American Nightmare, what do you want to talk about? Because we had a big documentary come out on Netflix recently. It dropped, and my God, has it been in the top 10 right away, in the top 10 for Netflix views, and it was the Mr. McMahon doc, and we are going to break it down a little bit here on the show. We're probably not going to do it because it'll take a lot to cover 6 hours of the show, but we'll break it down an hour way. But before we get into it, why don't you guys tell me what you thought of the doc? Fernando, why don't you go first?
Well, I mean, I've said this to a few people already, and I think I've dropped this to you much in audio messages on Instagram Messenger. But listen, first and foremost, I mean, I'm a pro wrestling fan. And, going back to watching, Hulk Hogan defeat the Iron Sheik in Madison Square Garden in 1984, and from that moment on, I was a Hulkamaniac. and I've been watching pro wrestling since then. Even before, going back to Ric Flair and Harley Race and the original Starrcade the year before. But the bottom line is that, the reason I'm still a fan today is because of Vince McMahon, the creative mind, the businessman. And, think about it. I mean, back in 1984, after Vince had just bought the company from his dad, right, when it was the WWWF, and then became the WWF. I mean, Vince and Kay took a big risk trying to buy the company from his dad. Certainly, it was well documented early on in the documentary that he pretty much had to mortgage a lot of things. What was it? I think rob Peter to pay Paul, as they say. I think Linda used that a lot. But the bottom line was that, I mean, taking a risk with MTV, which again, MTV had just started. So MTV was as mainstream as it got. And look at Vince being able to negotiate the war to settle the score, a primetime episode on MTV of Hulk Hogan versus Rowdy Roddy Piper, and getting celebrities involved, right? Which would consequently go into creating the first WrestleMania in Madison Square Garden. Now, again, I'm an old man compared to you two here, but I remember WrestleMania. Obviously, you have to watch it on closed circuit, very limited pay-per-view access at that time. But, I mean, that's why we fell in love with wrestling, right? Just like we're sports fans, right? And we think about the World Series, and we think about the Super Bowl and the Stanley Cup Finals and the NBA, like the FIFA World Cup, whatever. I mean, WrestleMania was our Super Bowl for pro wrestling fans, right? Because we weren't really privy to the NWA yet, per se, up in the Northeast. Unless you went somewhere for closed circuit, you didn't get to watch Starrcade. Unless you had cable and you didn't have TBS on your cable system, you weren't watching the National Wrestling Alliance. So WWF was like our first introduction into pro wrestling. And listen, the reason we have gimmicks today, the reason we still own DVDs, the reason we buy shirts as grown men into our 40s like myself is because of Vince, really. It's because of what Vince did for the business, right? Trying to revolutionize it. And let's be fair too. I mean, Vince again was a really shrewd businessman. Why the insistence on sports entertainment? What's for tax purposes? You can go around different states around the country, and if you can sort of circumvent the athletic commissions in the respective states, right? It's taxed differently, right? It's also regulated differently. So, Vince again was well ahead of his time when it came to making sure that he could regulate a product that could appeal to different demographics. And, to this day, we look at Vince creating WrestleMania 2, 3. I mean, what it meant, putting all his eggs in one basket with Terry Bollea as the guy to push instead of Dusty Rhodes, right? There was that talk that maybe Dusty Rhodes was the guy. And you know what? We'll never know. It's Monday morning quarterbacking. Who knows what would happen with Dusty? But he put all his eggs in a basket with Terry Bollea. He basically went around the country, gobbled up territories like Unicron, eating up planets. A little Transformers reference there for anyone that remembers. But the point was that he was a great businessman. But I think it's important to separate Vince, the businessman, the promoter, the creative mind, from what we've learned about Vince McMahon, the human being. So whether it's Dark Side of the Ring, whether it's podcasts by former pro wrestlers, whether it's lawsuits, I think it's important to differentiate our fandom about pro wrestling. And because of Vince really creating that fandom for us at a very young age, to what we're learning or what we've learned about Vince McMahon. Never mind the recent indictment or investigations. We're talking about stories about bad behavior backstage long before, Bret Hart got screwed in Montreal, depends who asks. Wendy Richter was screwed in Madison Square Garden by Vince McMahon.
Yes.
And then we started learning about bad backstage behavior, the infidelity with Linda. Now, again, let me be very clear. I'm not going to pass judgment on a man because as men, we've all made bad decisions because of pussy. Well, let's be honest. If you haven't, then you have pussy. That's the bottom line. So we've all made bad decisions because of pussy. Having said that, I'm a broke ass. So my infidelities, my indiscretions are nothing compared to a guy with status, with money and influence. What did we learn about Vince? We learned that that got to him. And I think it's important to separate, again, our fandom for pro wrestling because of Vince. And if you need a reminder about disliking Vince the human being, this documentary, I don't have enough fingers and toes to name the examples they give you.
Yeah, absolutely. What about you, Tyler? What'd you think of it before we jump in?
Well, it's interesting that you say that because when you say Vince the human being, I think there's two different guys there. Because you hear all the time about, oh, Vince did this for, Vince did this, Vince did that for so and so. But then there's the guy that's, oh, he's abusive to announcers. He's, doing all this. He's the accusations that are out there now. So I just don't think you can put him in one box. Obviously, what these accusations, kind of trump everything.
Yeah.
Because there's just some things in life you can't do. But and I think when I don't know if Fernando, I don't know if you heard Mick Foley's recent comments about how it hasn't affected his memories of Vince. But I think a guy like that has already compartmentalized a lot because he's had a very rocky relationship with Vince, but ultimately he probably remembers a guy who did a lot for him.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we learned that, right? We learned that certain talent over the decades benefited greatly from Vince. Vince took a chance on a lot of people that, again, Mick Foley's the best example. Mick Foley was a guy that kind of wore out his welcome in WCW. Bischoff didn't really know what to do with him. The Cactus Jack thing, I think, really had just become passé for Bischoff. And what did Vince do? Vince reinvented his character, gave him something that, let's be honest, could have been destined to fail. But
yeah, Mankind was pretty bad. Yeah.
Mick Foley got it over. And Mick Foley, listen, he pretty much paired him with Mark Calloway to feud early on. And let's be honest, I mean, Mark Calloway and Mick Foley have created great memories as workers. I mean, they've had some of the most memorable matches in WWF/WWE history.
Yep.
But I think that, again, Vince, to Tyler's point, I think that, Vince as a human being, we've learned, again, whether it's the Dark Side of the Ring episodes, whether it's the Jimmy Snuka thing, whether it's shortchanging people, whether it's, listen, let's look at the example of Dr. D. David Schultz. I mean, when John Stossel in the mid-'80s was going around trying to expose the business, what did David Schultz do? David Schultz pretty much
did what Vince told him to do.
Became a martyr for the business. And Vince is never going to tell someone outright, like, yeah, listen, I think you should do this. Vince has been very good at covering his ass like any promoter. Now, again, what I don't like about the perception about Vince is, let's be honest, if there was ever documentaries about Jerry Jarrett and, Jim Crockett and Vern Gagne, I'm sure we could learn about things that people have it's gone unnoticed. But again, Vince has been such a big character, and Vince really became, as they say, the evil empire. Really, the microscope has been on him. Could we find stories about Jerry Jarrett and Vern Gagne and the Crockett's and Bill Watts? I'm sure.
I could tell you a story right now. How about dressing up Booker T and Stevie Ray as convicts, having them come out with chains like convicts? That's what he wanted to do until they decided to make Harlem Heat a regular tag team. And that's just not me reading some Joe Schmo. Huh?
He who?
Crockett. That's what he wanted to do with Booker T and Stevie Ray. And that's just not me just telling you this like, oh, I read that somewhere. That's Eric Bischoff telling us that on 83 Weeks, telling us that that's how they wanted to debut Booker T and Stevie Ray. And then they realized, black guys, convict outfits, chains, maybe not a great idea.
Yeah, I mean, and even though it was in the South, it still wouldn't resonate. And mind you, that was like 92, 93.
Yeah.
Very different time 30 years ago, right? In terms of like the social climate and how we looked at, race and everything. But again, like Vince put a bullseye on his back for a lot of years. Again, once he put people out of business, again, heavy is the head that wears the crown. That's right. With Vince. Now, having said that, it's been hard because I'm pretty sure the people they interview on Netflix, I think to Tyler's point, and it's a good one, a lot of people have compartmentalized how they view Vince McMahon. Again, a lot of them from Trish Stratus to others. I mean, unfortunately, God rest her soul, Ashley Massaro. Who knows what we could ever learn if people ever really came out. Now, again, what's alarming to me is that Vince McMahon feels the need to get Kevin Dunn and kick out whatever Rockies.
Yeah, that was weird to me, hearing that news today.
And he feels the need to I guess, produce a documentary to refute what's on Netflix. The bottom line is this. I think that Vince is going to have a tough time. Again, the legal matter is the legal matter. That's still under investigation. I'm sure his attorneys are like, you can't comment on this. You'd be stupid to do so. You're incriminating yourself. But I think that Vince also wants to illustrate, like the Bruce Pritchard example about his wife, right? Given 4 years to live because of melanoma. Well, because of Vince's, whether it was financial assistance, what maybe knowing doctors, again, when you're that connected, dude, and you have that much influence and status, you're going to know people in society. And listen, Bruce Pritchard is never going to throw Vince under the bus. Vince saved his wife's life from cancer.
Right.
Yeah.
And he also, while she was sick, he let him pretty much work from home.
Yeah.
And when was Vince ever that flexible with people that were under his supervision, whether it's Jim Ross, Jim Cornette, whoever? I mean, again, I think Vince wants to accentuate that in whatever he's going to produce.
Yeah.
But the problem is that, number one, and I know Pat mentioned that in a conversation with me via text, like this documentary had a little bit too much Dave Meltzer for me, I think at certain moments. And I get it. I think he was there as sort of a historian type of presence in a documentary.
Yeah.
But again, I think if you went into this, I was expecting a lot more hellacious things.
Yes.
I have to tell you, it's almost like, well, you meet a girl on Tinder, you swipe right, you're having a few text conversations. Yeah, she looks really hot. And you meet her in person. She's not as pretty as her pictures. And she's also like not very stimulating. I think that's what I got out of this Netflix series, where there's a lot of things that if you're marks like me, we've already learned about Vince.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, I mean that's kind of how it was. The first episode of the documentary opens up right away, letting you know that it was filmed in 2021. So we don't go over the recent lawsuit. It tells you right away, and then they kind of let you know who's going to be interviewed and stuff like that. And we get pretty much the who's who of professional wrestling being interviewed with Hulk Hogan, Bret Hart, Shane McMahon, Eric Bischoff. You get Bob Costas, Dave Meltzer, which for me, the moment I saw Dave Meltzer in this thing, I was just like, oh, this is like a work. Like I was like having there's no credibility there for Dave Meltzer. There's nothing about it. I mean, even
okay, Eric.
Well, all right. So let's talk about let's just jump into the why he hearkened so much on WrestleMania 3's attendance. That was not done for Vince McMahon. That had nothing to do with Vince. That was specifically done because of what just transpired in London.
Well, I think
me was like that has nothing to do with Vince.
Well, I think there's a certain folklore that's out there, right?
He's talked about that long before that.
Well, I mean, I think that there's some folklore about what WrestleMania 3 represents. It was the first major wrestling event that really had that sort of attendance figure. And listen, it's been debated over the years. It sort of remains one of those, I don't know, urban legends about what really went on in Pontiac, Michigan that night. The bottom line is that it was box office. It was, and also too, I think, listen, something that I had never learned, because even though it's been dissected for a long time, one of the things this documentary was, I think, very illuminating about was there were moments like, again, Hogan, Andre, and Vince to the day of still trying to negotiate, work out the finish of WrestleMania 3. Again, all we've learned for years is that
Hogan's told us that a lot.
Yeah, like Andre was in declining health. Andre wanted to pass the torch, but then we're learning, like literally the day of, Terry's running to Vince. Wait a minute, Andre hasn't told me yet what we're going to do, and pretty much, Hogan drops the leg and Andre doesn't kick out. So part of me is like, okay, that's a new twist. I didn't know that. Okay, new things you learn. So I think this documentary did a lot for hardcore wrestling fans like us, to sort of give us a new perspective about things that historically, they've always been up for debate, right? WrestleMania 3. Yeah. Listen, again, and I feel that Meltzer was there from the perspective of trying to be that historian. Like, again, the example of when Hogan slammed Andre, let's be honest, Andre would slam before. If you're a fan, again, I'm an old man compared to you guys.
Well, yeah, that's exactly what, that's one of the things that should be mentioned.
Like, I remember, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Kamala, the Ugandan headhunter, who, by the way, should be in the Hall of Fame, God rest his soul, I believe was the first guy to slam Andre the Giant. Not again that's ever gets talked about. I know
Man,
Hogan
that's
signed them and-
crazy. Brian Danielson wrestled the guy who worked Andre the Giant. That is so fucking cool.
Isn't that crazy? Yeah. So
Yeah,
it's
that is so cool.
So it's like I think Meltzer served a purpose from the perspective of like, yes, there's a historian that's there. And I get that. Listen, Meltzer's done it to himself in recent years by just putting some bad takes out there, bad reporting. Listen, not every journalist is perfect, you know. But for a guy that pretty much makes a living charging people, you know, $12 a month and makes millions of dollars in this newsletter and whatever else and video content, the bottom line is, I think Meltzer served a purpose. But I'm also kind of concerned about why this documentary, because the way it was hyped, gentlemen, it seemed like, man, this is going to be like a total burial of Vince. And to some extent it was. But again, if I had to grade it like, okay, an A is the epitome of a great grade in burials, and an F was like, okay, kind of like status quo, whatever. I got to tell you, I looked at this as a C. I didn't think this was overwhelmingly incriminating on Vince. Maybe until the last episode when it came to discussing what these journalists at the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal were doing about is, you know, the trafficking case and all that. But the steroid trials, we knew about this.
Yeah.
So stuff like that was, you know, not the most refreshing thing to see, but from a historical perspective, you know, not bad to revisit.
No, absolutely not. And Tyler, what did you think of the fact that like a wrestler from a different promotion, whether it be Roddy Piper, whether it be Harley Race, Greg the Hammer Valentine, Dusty Rhodes, that every single time they were pretty much contacted by Vince McMahon and WWE, that they decided, let me go over there. What did you think about the fact that that was considered like bad business, but Vince just soaked it up and he brought them in? Because they highlighted that a lot, that he was unfair, that he would like steal everybody else's talent, because he did that with Hulk Hogan as well.
I don't see why that's. I mean,
he had the money to do it.
You're a Yankees fan, so like you're used to that.
There's two Yankee fans here.
Yeah, and that's what they do. They go around and they steal other people's talent. People develop talent and they go and get it.
Yeah.
Well, in fairness, though, to Tyler's point, to your point, Mach, I mean, I did find it a little bit funny when Vince was referencing what Bischoff was doing to him in the late 90s.
Right, exactly. Like, why are you? Yeah, exactly. Why are you?
Funny because if you looked at the systemic regionalization of what wrestling was, right? And again, for fans like us, we know about the territories, whether we watch the Dark Side of the Territories or we've read about it in books. Like what Vince did was very gutsy and risky, because let's be honest, there were promoters that had told his dad, like, your son's going to end up in the bottom of the door if he's
that was interesting as well, because that's how things were done back in the day.
Yeah.
This was like, we're talking about Teamster era. We're talking about like the John Gotti era. This is how things happened back then. And Vince was pretty much told by these guys down south, like, hey, and from the Midwest, they were told, like, you're stealing our guys, and, you know, don't make us turn into Carlos Colon on you. Like, that's what they were trying to like tell him and stuff. And he didn't care. He took the threats, like, okay, well then come get me. That was so interesting. This man had no fear.
Yeah, listen, again, Vince had a very fearless dynamic to his personality when it came to business. I think, again, listen, he gambled a lot, okay, whether it was partnering with MTV, whether or not that was going to resonate mainstream, whether it was working with Dick Ebersol on NBC, again, listen, I marked out last week on Raw when we see tickets going on sale for Saturday night's main event in December.
Yeah.
At the Nassau Coliseum. And what's the first thing you hear? You hear the theme from the 80s. Now, again, for marks like me, I lost my mind. I said, oh my God, this might.
You sent it to me.
Is that going to be a house show, or is it?
I think it might be televised on Peacock. I could be wrong. But the point is that these are business decisions that Vince made that worked out well. Yeah. And then when Vince was sort of like being critical of Bischoff about, well, look what Bischoff was doing, look what Turner was doing. Again, it was sort of like, that's the bill coming due for business decisions you made back then. Again, it's business. I get it. But I just thought it was really funny because you could see that Bischoff took a little glee in that, and rightfully so. Listen, Bischoff is the only person. It's not going to be Tony Khan. We've seen 5 years of it already, and it's not happening. Eric Bischoff, for a period of literally 3 years, made Vince McMahon reconsider whether or not to reorder water coolers in the building in Stamford, whether or not to come back on house shows, whether or not to tape more because Vince was on the brink of bankruptcy, not
Yeah.
because he was spending irresponsibly, but
But
he was
see,
on the brink, and it sort of puts it again. It's why I always hold Bischoff in such high regard because Bischoff, as a business person, was great creatively. I'll argue that until the day I die that there are a lot of things I think Bischoff could have done better. But Bischoff was smart in that he knew how to get to Vince, spending money,
Mhm.
creating a product that, let's be honest, and again, I hate to belate the point, but there was a time 30 years ago where, long before digital cable and DVR and this, we literally had to flip back and forth between
yes.
and at times, if you had a TV/VCR that you could record
Mm-hmm.
at the same time, you're recording Nitro and watching WWF or vice versa. That's how insane wrestling got for us. And again, I think
was
it's
awesome.
It was a great time to be alive as a wrestling fan. We're never going to live that period ever again because no one's saying, "Oh man, I don't know if I can watch Raw." Whether it's 2 hours now.
Well, we're never going to live that period again because there are. Back then, WCW was so good.
Yes.
And whether people could say WWE wasn't good at the time, but you're lying to yourself because they might have not been winning the ratings war, but that was the beginning of the Nation of Domination of Stone Cold Steve Austin. You still had Owen Hart. You still had Ken Shamrock. You still had Triple H. You still had D-Generation X. It was the beginning of all of those guys. You still had, Shawn Michaels was leading the way. You can say you didn't like WWF at the time, you're lying. So you were flipping back and forth. I'm telling you right now, if Dynamite was on the same night as Raw, I don't give a shit. I'm watching Raw. I don't care if I got to sit through commercials. I'm not flipping over to watch.
I'll be honest. I would probably flip back and forth. I like wrestling.
I do too, but I know that here's another thing that I think that before we jump into this, I really want to ask you.
So you're saying that you're not gonna flip to see Danielson, to see Swerve, to see Hangman.
Yes, absolutely. Here's the one thing I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to explain why. It has nothing to do with the hate of the company, so wipe the smile off your face. What I wanted to say is, if you go on YouTube directly after Dynamite, there's a 10 to 15 minute clip of every single match, so you don't have to worry about it. They tell you everything. I don't ever have to watch Dynamite because it's for free on YouTube. Tomorrow, skip Dynamite and then go on their YouTube channel. It has everything on there for you.
But much in fairness, and again, I'm the last person to ever defend All Elite Wrestling, but in fairness, they have to do that because there isn't a streaming service where that content is readily available. Listen, there are some pay-per-views over the years I've enjoyed watching. All Out 2021, the Jericho MJF match, other things too, the debut of Adam Cole, God rest his soul, I don't know where he is, the debut of Danielson. But unfortunately, because of no streaming service, I have to live on YouTube to catch AEW. So I think
we're Team Britt Baker in this house.
No, but that's a smart move, I think, to do that because in the meantime, you have to give that audience something to be able to share, to be able to circulate. Because again, I'm hoping they go to Max, whether put the library on it, put every pay-per-view on there, that'd be amazing. But I think it's not. Listen, I think to indict them for doing that is, I think, unfair. Where they have to make the move what they have.
No, I'm not indicting them. I'm just telling you that that's why I would flip back and forth because I know that I could watch Raw in its entirety.
Sure.
And then when both shows are over, I wouldn't miss anything in AEW. That's what I'm saying. Is what you're saying is true. They're giving it to you. Yeah. Go ahead.
I could make the same argument that I can go on Hulu tomorrow or today and watch Raw.
But YouTube is free. I'm not paying for Hulu.
Not anymore. I think that's done with Hulu. I think that once they move to
Netflix, it'll be done. But I think it's still going till then.
Oh really? Okay. I thought SmackDown and Raw.
Yeah.
Okay.
SmackDown is gone.
I'm sorry. Okay, I thought it was on.
SmackDown is gone. I watched Raw on there last week, so I'm not sure about this week, but last week it was there.
Okay.
So let me ask you guys something. Let's wrap up episode 1 here by talking about this John Stossel and this whole lawsuit and everything, and then the Richard Belzer and Hulk Hogan thing.
That's right. Yeah. A week before me.
Yeah, being that we love the wrestling business so much. Did you guys find it appalling? Were you annoyed? Or were you prideful that when Vince went into the locker room and said somebody should do something about that guy, and that, a wrestler decided he was going to do something? Because to me, I'm going to give you my opinion quickly, and I'll let you guys talk about it for a little bit. I was happy. I thought I didn't get all of that. That moment, that was brand new to me because I don't believe that they talk about that on the Dark Side of the Ring episode for this. We don't know that Vince goes and tells the boys like somebody should go do something, and then that guy was like,
well,
praised, and they like threw a party for him.
Well, Mach, in the David Schultz episode of Dark Side of the Ring, I think it's discussed in detail. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it gets discussed where, David's convinced that Vince in one shape, way, or form told him, but not directly. I mean, again, you want a plausible deniability, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. But what I'm saying is like hearing Tony Atlas say when he was asked like how he felt about it, and they were like, we were celebrating. Like, that's how I felt. Like, that was the only likable moment for me with Tony Atlas in the episode. Because I was just like, yeah, I agree. They should have slapped that guy harder. Absolutely. Like, that's how I felt. I was like, don't just come in here. Like, sometimes you can't just say shit. Like, like, nowadays, you can't do anything like that. So I miss a time from back in the day when you could just slap someone.
Yeah.
Well, I think the Stossel incident highlights the fact that wrestling was still under the microscope of, listen, we've come to learn, and I think Hulk Hogan had a great line. It's like, yeah, it's fake, brother, but, I got 20 surgeries, and I'll tell you right now, it's not fake. So, I always, listen, to this day, I always defend, even, like the girl I'm seeing now is like, oh, babe, I don't know why you watch wrestling. I'm like, babe, you watch the Kardashians. Give me a break. Like, that's as orchestrated as you can get. I like it because of the athleticism, storytelling, the characters, whatever. I think that wrestling in 1984, 85, again, let's remember, this is right after WrestleMania, the success that it was. John Stossel was sort of a star on the rise on ABC News, and they felt like, hey, let's go after this industry that I think is gaining popularity, especially with children and young adults, and let's expose it. Now, again, being a journalist myself, I mean, there are many of my peers I can't stand, and believe me, when I see that happen to journalists, I'm not crying for them, but I think that what he did as a person trying to expose the business, I think, listen, you're asking for trouble. You're basically trying to fill the pot with boiling water and thinking, oh, it's not going to boil, it's not going to spill over. And it did. The Richard Belzer thing I thought was interesting in a different way because, again, it's a week before WrestleMania.
I didn't think Hogan did. I'm not a Hogan fan. I'm an OG Hogan. Like Pat will tell you, I'm an OG Hogan hater. I have been since I was like a child.
Sure. But
like WrestleMania 9 killed that man for me. When he kicked out of 5 elbow drops from Macho Man Randy Savage, I was like, fuck this dude.
Well, the Belzer thing is interesting because it was literally a week before WrestleMania.
Yeah.
Vince is sending Mr. T and Hogan at every media scrum possible to promote because, again, a lot was riding on WrestleMania. Again, it wasn't like it is now. It's not on a network. It's not streaming. I mean, pay-per-view was limited. It was basically closed circuit. So you're relying on physical newspapers to list the cities and venues that are playing this. And remember, it was 1 PM. Think about WrestleMania on a Sunday at 1 PM, right? That's crazy. But Belzer's incident, I think, highlighted this notion of like, well, yeah, they're pro wrestlers, but is it really real? I don't know. And what you saw with Belzer basically is, and God rest his soul, I mean, I loved him on Law and Order. He's a great actor. But you saw literally the back of his head split open after that fall. And again, it took a while to settle. But I think that again, continued to put wrestling in this sort of like, well, it's very carny. It's not really real. Is anybody really getting hurt? I can tell you, watching wrestling back then, watch the old Madison Square Garden house shows. There's no padding on the concrete floor of Madison Square Garden. Okay,
no, there isn't.
So when Jake the Snake DDT'd Ricky Steamboat into concrete, that was pretty much the way wrestling was in the mid-'80s. So, I think there was this perception about how wrestling was being marketed to people and whether or not it was a healthy alternative to entertainment. And Stossel, listen, I didn't feel bad for Stossel. I think Stossel was trying to bait someone into it.
Yes.
And unfortunately, David Schultz took the bait. David Schultz was the casualty there because Vince had to fire him. There was a lawsuit.
Fortunately enough, the law has changed, so you can't bait people anymore. Like, you're not going to win a lawsuit like that in 2024. So that's a good thing. Tyler, what did you think about this stuff, the Richard Belzer stuff, and then the Stossel thing?
Well, I'd seen the Stossel thing a bunch, and I did know about the Belzer thing because I read it, a really great. It's 3 books, but they have combined them into one called the Titan Trilogy.
Mhm.
It's called Titan. I think it's called Titan Shattered, Titan Sinking, and Titan Screwed.
Okay.
But anyway, they mentioned that in there. I love the I miss the days when you could just slap people.
Yeah,
That was great.
absolutely.
That was great by you. That speaks right to your mentality on the whole CM Punk thing as well.
Yeah. Yep. Perry deserved.
What they don't mention about Schultz is before that happened, leading up to Mania or the announcement of Mania. I don't know if it's Brett or this other book that I'm referring to. Schultz wanted to jump Piper and take his spot when they announced it. So he wanted to just be there, and then once he's there, right?
So he wanted to grab the brass ring. He thought slapping Stossel was going to grab the brass ring. That was like him.
No.
Like,
This is before any of that happened. He was going to, when Piper was going out to set up WrestleMania, he was going to jump him and go out instead. And
like a beatdown?
Yeah, and then Brett and Anvil, I believe, stopped him.
Well, Brett and Anvil should let that happen, because I know a lot of people think that just because he wore a dress that he was a Mary or anything like that. But Piper would have smacked.
But Mach, hindsight's 2020. I mean, I think we're thankful that it didn't happen to Piper.
Yeah, agreed.
Vince would have had to really reconsider what he was doing with Piper. He would have had to let him go like he did with Schultz. And let's be honest, we probably wouldn't have gotten, because I think the Schultz thing was before WrestleMania. So the idea of sort of outcasting Piper going into that season for WrestleMania. I mean, listen, again, a lot was riding on that main event between Mr. and Hulk Hogan against Piper and Mr. Wonderful. So listen, I think in hindsight, Schultz being the casualty there wasn't the worst thing for Vince. He still kept a good core of his big guys.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, listen, maybe one day we'll learn that after that happened, Vince talked to Schultz and said, listen, I'll give you a little payday. I'll take care of you financially. But let's be honest, though. You go back and read, Schultz was kind of like the redheaded stepchild. He wasn't getting booked. He pretty much almost became a pariah in the business. And let's be honest, it's not like, he was going to go to different territories. At that time, once Vince got rid of him, he was kind of like blackballed for a while. So it wouldn't shock me if Vince maybe turned around and helped him financially. We'll never know. I mean, I don't know if it'll ever come out, because I don't think Schultz has ever said it either.
No, agreed. They it's just like my favorite Ben Affleck movie, Jersey Girl. After he curses out Will Smith and then he can't get hired anywhere. It doesn't matter that he did it, and everybody's happy that he did it because Will Smith, I guess, deserved it for being a prima donna in the movie. It didn't matter. Like there were people literally praising him. You did this, good job. But we can't hire you. Like we can't bring you in here. You know what I mean? Like we can't be the person that brings in the guy that slapped this reporter. Like I'm sure that's how it was too. But moving on to episode 2, we'll just breeze through this, because this one's really just about the rise of Hogan, what he meant to the business, and then the steroid era. And it jumps right into him jumping ship to WCW. Obviously, we don't really need to touch on that. There was nothing new in that episode, I felt like. That was kind of like, I felt like that episode was a wasted episode. It was almost like that. That's why I felt like there were a couple episodes that were kind of wasted. Do you guys agree? Where it was almost like there was zero new information that we got out of the episode as in a whole.
Yeah, but Mach, remember, I think that this documentary was also catered to the casual fan or Netflix's desire to attract a new fan to the industry. And let's be honest, again, for people like you and I, we've read countless books. We've watched podcast after podcast. We've watched every Dark Side of the Ring episode. We've watched Dark Side of the 90s on Vice, right? That also incorporate wrestling. So it's like, the attempt was there to either, again, refresh our memories.
Yeah.
To also maybe attract a new audience to like, hey, yeah, there's this person who knows about pro wrestling, but doesn't really know that when Hogan left in the summer of 93, right? Because him and Vince couldn't work out a new deal. And there was all that, basically, there was still some resentment by Vince about Hogan in the steroid trial. I think that, people didn't know that backstory. And I think it's important from an illustrated perspective to put that out there because it helps people connect the dots. Either A, for people who forgot, who haven't kept up with this stuff like you and like three of us do, or again, to sort of start laying the groundwork for, okay, this is what Hogan did. This is how Hogan ultimately, let's be honest. And I don't think this gets stipulated enough in documentaries or books. Hogan going to WCW for more money, less dates, and whatever. This was Hogan's, I think, indirect FU to Vince because Vince saw that Hogan's star was fading. The Americana, the real American, the take your vitamins, say your prayers. That superhero thing was eroding. And what were we moving towards? We were moving towards smaller guys, right, who were not abusing steroids. We were moving towards the Bret Harts, the Shawn Michaels, the Tatankas, Undertaker. We're moving towards now again. Lex Luger came over, and you try to resuscitate the Warrior. The bottom line is that I think that there was a point of Hogan resenting Vince for not saying, "Hey, I made you a lot of money. I think you owe me. I think keeping me is in your best interest." And Vince made a calculated decision and said, "No, I don't need you anymore. I've squeezed every bit of juice out of that lemon. Here's a whole new tree full of lemons. Let me start squeezing that into the lemonade jar." And that's
Unfortunately, he was wrong because Hogan had a hell of a lot more money and a hell of a lot more time and a hell of a lot more great matches, because I would argue that a lot of Hulk Hogan's best matches in his career are matches he had in WCW. Like his matches with Ric Flair, his match with Vader, his matches with Sting, his match with Lex Luger on Monday Night Raw, his match with the Giant where he beats the Giant. Like these matches were actually good matches. His matches with Roddy Piper in WCW were better than his WWF Roddy Piper matches. They were just really good.
What are we talking about? Starrcade 96? Is that what we're talking about?
Starrcade 96
we're talking about the cage match. I'm talking about the cage match.
Well, the Starrcade match was better than the cage match, don't you think?
That match is all right.
I mean, what I'm saying is I just felt like he had better matches in WCW than he had in WWF. But what I also wanted to say is they do kind of touch on
real quick. I think what was being asked of Hogan in WWF from 90 to 91 to 92, and even when he came back in 93 for that short little run, again, what was being asked of him was I think it's a very different priority list than it was in WCW. I think he was still trying to convey that character. Again, remember, people forget this, and I know he wasn't involved in the documentary, but there was a period in the business where Vince took a gamble on Jim Hellwig, God rest his soul, and took the belt off of Hogan, right? Just like he took the belt off of just like he put the belt on Macho Man. And for a full calendar year, Macho Man tried to carry that company to no fault of Randy Savage, God rest his soul too. He tried his best to carry a company that, again, was still having a void of Hogan. The year after with Jim Hellwig, Vince still saw value in Hogan, but in that Hogan, in that superhero role. Again, and what do we see? The Sergeant Slaughter thing. I mean, I think people forget. Again, I remember because I remember this.
The Sergeant Slaughter thing happened directly because Ultimate Warrior was holding him over a barrel.
No, I agree. No, I agree. But I think also too, like, and I'm not saying this in a derogatory manner, but you guys were kids in 1991. I remember this vividly. I was in my teens, and I remember specifically learning about what Slaughter represented as a character. And like, obviously we've learned since then, the reason WrestleMania 7 wasn't in the Coliseum was because the city of Los Angeles and the LAPD told Vince, listen, you're going to have to bring in additional security. We cannot guarantee this guy walking down the aisle in an open air stadium. Because someone's going to take a shot. Sergeant Slaughter was walking his kids to school with a bulletproof vest. That's how kayfabe got us. In the 90s.
I miss wrestling.
Think about that. Think about the fact that Sergeant Slaughter couldn't take his
that was so awesome.
to school
because
he was afraid of getting shot at. That's how good Vince was at blurring the lines. But
That
again,
is so great.
but I think that
I remember my grandfather had the WWF magazine and it had the pictures of them fireballing Hogan.
yeah.
Yeah. Oh man, wrestling was just so different back.
Your
It's
point,
just,
Mach, I think it's a very different Hogan that went to Turner, went to Atlanta. Very different Hogan. Now again, he saw creative control, and I think there were some things early on that kind of blew your mind, like the view with the Butcher and all the things. But the point was, I think what was being asked of Terry Bollea post WWF, I think was very, very different. I think Bischoff knew that let's push him in this way. You're right. I think he had very different matches. Listen, the only match we ever saw with Ric Flair were house shows. Remember, it was supposed to be WrestleMania 8 in Indianapolis. It was supposed to be Hogan and Flair. Flair keeps the title after winning the title at the Rumble, and keeping the belt against Hogan. Because remember, Hogan was leaving after the steroid thing, and for whatever reason, the politicking, something happened where Terry was
Tyler will tell you exactly what happened. He knows exactly what happened, why that match didn't happen.
They booked them on house shows, and the house shows didn't draw. And so then they got to they thought that their audience didn't really know who Ric Flair was.
And who was the guy that said this?
Well, Bruce Pritchard is the one who said it, but he's not the only one who thought it.
That guy's
it's not like he did it. It's not like he personally did it.
He's the guy who said he brought out Diamond Dallas Page as a stalker because nobody knew who he was.
There was a belief in WWE, WWF that their audience wasn't watching the other channel.
Everybody. He was in a fucking movie.
No, but I think that's more Vince. Like Vince, again, I think to his credit, was so WWF driven in terms of his company for 20 hours a day. I don't think he really cared about what was going on until it started affecting his bottom line in 95, 96, 97. But for the longest time, I think that once Vince knew during the Attitude Era that he had surpassed WCW in the ratings and that he was, again, it was a better product for a while anyway. I think Vince just took the notion of like, no one's watching that. So, and again, unfortunately, Vince has always had this detriment in his personality where if it's not a WWF/WWE creation, I don't care for it. Again, which is why to this day, and I'll plant a flag on the hill, I'll die on this hill. It's why I think that Vince never truly appreciated how to use Steve Borden and use Sting in a way that he should have. Try to sign him sooner.
You're gonna make me go off the fucking rails here.
No, I'm saying sign him sooner. I don't think I'm wrong when I say this. Sign him sooner away from TNA. And I get it that Steve Borden had a better schedule in Florida with TNA. He didn't want to, again, there was the concern about how Vince was going to use him and market him. And I got to tell you, like the way Vince produced Sting, I think was an indictment of like it's all about Vince's world. And if it's not a WWF creation, then I'm not going to give it validity or I'm not going to give it oxygen. And I think that's one of my pet peeves about Vince creatively. Like, okay, the Freebirds existed and they had a great run. The Road Warriors, the idea of like you had to change people up because no one's watching wrestling in the South or in the Midwest. Like,
you're not a Doc Hendricks fan?
What's that?
You're not a Doc Hendricks fan?
I mean, I like Michael Hayes, but I think that Vince was very myopic in that, nobody else watched.
This is why I call bullshit on that, because we've seen him take talent from other companies and push them to the moon. He brought the Steiner brothers in, and they were pushed. Like, he was like, he brought the Legion of Doom in. They were pushed. Yeah, he did this shit with people. So the fact that he would say, okay, let's use, so I use two, like, monumental, like, legendary names. Let's use somebody that he made legendary, that he took from another company that was just a name, and he turned into a legend of the business. Chris Jericho. Why did he take Jericho from WCW, bring him to his house, have a meeting in front of his entire creative team at his house if he wasn't paying attention to the other company?
That's fair. Vince, in that case, Vince Russo was a huge fan.
But even before Jericho, though, Mach, I mean, Mark Calloway. Look at how Mark Calloway was used in Mid-South.
Yeah.
look how he was brought up. Now, again, we've always heard the stories of what he could have been called and all that. It's very funny to sort of look back on it historically. But I think that even before Jericho, you look at Mark Calloway and like look what Vince did to Glenn Jacobs. Yes, Jericho's a great example of a guy that obviously either Vince was watching or Pritchard or Pat Patterson and whatever. I don't disagree whatsoever.
He brought the Radicals in and put them right away into a program with Triple H and The Rock.
Oh, no, I agree. But again, going back to your premise about Hogan, I think what Hogan represented in this episode is, I think that, listen, Vince rode this guy as much as he could. And the reason, listen, we say it all the time, as a lot of marks will say, well, Hogan, Vince never took the belt off of Hogan. There were other heels during that time that could have deserved a title run. Hogan was reliable. Say what you want about Terry Bollea, the human being. While Jake Roberts, Kurt Hennig, Rick Rude, whoever were out partying, doing coke, sniffing coke off of strippers, hooking up with women in hotels, whatever, till 4 or 5 in the morning. Terry Bollea was at the gym at 5:30 in the morning working up. So what?
He said that. He made fun of Mick Foley about that.
When he was at the top of the card, and mind you, I think that's myopic by Terry Bollea, where we all know that Mick Foley's cardio in matches he's had
crazy,
infinitely better than anything Hogan could have done. But I think that Vince recognized that Hogan, had a value to him, and he knew that, hey, everyone's going to eat at the table if Hogan's at the top of the card. And listen, were there heels that I felt, hey, maybe should have beaten Hogan for the belt? King Kong Bundy, Mr. Wonderful, Rick Rude, but Vince felt Hogan's a guy that's reliable. He's the guy that at the top of the ticket, as they say, is going to
still that way
down, and it did. And listen, you can't kill Vince for being a smart businessman. That's one of the things I will always defend Vince on. Vince, when it came to business and creative, listen, are there some bookings over 40 years that I didn't like? Sure. And I'm a mark, so I'm going to disagree with some bookings. But by and large, and again, I'm going to quote the great Patrick V. Rivera on this one. The reason we are at where we're at today is by and large, Vince bookings made sense and they got us to where we are today. So again, we can kill Vince, the booker, the creative, the promoter, but there's a reason why he was selling out stadiums, going to cities around the country that were the idea of Vince going to the South and the Midwest, the idea that during the time of World Class Championship Wrestling, where the Von Erichs were, if you're watching World Class on ESPN and whatever channel it was on, the fact that Vince was going to Dallas, to the Reunion Arena, the fact he was going to, forget about what it's called now, the Summit in Houston, Texas. Vince was, again, a pioneer for his time.
Yeah.
But again, that wasn't without its demons.
Yeah, I mean, I got to be honest with you. Go ahead.
They bought Houston. They bought it, the territory from Paul Bosch. That's one of the ones that he didn't steal.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because that's Bruce Pritchard. That's where he came from. So he talks about it a lot, where Vince bought the territory, and that's how he got the job.
Okay.
Oh, so he became like his Moneyball. He was his Jonah Hill. Bruce Pritchard was his Jonah Hill. Yeah. The one thing that I loved about this documentary that I feel like it's going to go under the radar because it is pretty much like a shot at Vince is I love that we got different character traits from certain people. Bret Hart, I felt like this was the most genuine he ever was in any interview. He was super self-aware.
I'm an artist.
Yes, that was. I mean, he was. But let's be honest. Like, he was very self-aware. He knew it. He's like, they put the title on me because they knew that I wasn't going to be caught with underage girls. They knew I wasn't going to be out doing all this stuff. And here's the one thing that I want to say about that because I feel like it goes unnoticed. Bret Hart did this stuff. Bret Hart committed infidelity. Bret Hart did cocaine.
Oh yeah,
he did this stuff. But you want to know the difference between Bret Hart and a lot of these other wrestlers that got in trouble? Bret Hart chose to tell us in an tell-all book instead of like it just being leaked and us finding out and people like, oh my God. It's like him and Shawn Michaels. They're so different, but they're very similar. Shawn Michaels didn't have these rumors about him either. And yeah, there was the steroid rumor that he refutes to this day. But a lot of what Sean, like a lot of what we knew about Sean, he told us himself.
Yeah.
It wasn't he got caught. It was he told us himself. And that's why I felt like Bret was very self-aware in this. I felt like this was the most, like, I'm a big Bret Hart fan. So for me to say this, hopefully you guys will understand. But I felt like he comes off as really likable because he's very honest. He's like, yeah, man, I knew that I was the champ because that they needed me. Right?
Yeah.
Like he just like knew it. I know another thing that I loved was Stephanie McMahon being very clear and saying, like, when she was asked, like, what do you think people think about your father? And she's like, what he wants them to think about him. You know what I mean? Like, she made it very, that was such a good quote. It was like, yeah, she definitely feels that way.
Well, I think the family members and the way they opined throughout the documentary, I think was very telling because it was three very different people. Linda, Stephanie, and Shane, I think, all brought very good dynamics to the documentary because their relationship with Vince was very different. All of them was very, very different. And I think that, you know, as you keep watching the documentary, you see that they look at Vince as a tragic figure. I think, listen, there's an element of Macbeth. And for anyone that's ever enjoyed reading Macbeth, it's one of my favorite, if not my favorite, Shakespearean play. I look at Macbeth as a telltale sign of a guy, once he gets power, what happens to him in his reign and also in his psyche. And I think we saw that with Vince. I think we saw a tragic figure materialize before. Now, again, it's not to say it's not self-inflicted. It is. It's self-inflicted. But I think there's an element of Vince that the family members and even some of the guys and girls that they interviewed, I think, to Tyler's point before, the compartmentalization of the way we perceive Vince is there's still an element of like, hey, there's a tragedy here still, which, it depends. You go into this documentary disliking Vince. I would make the case that you dislike him more. I don't think you find the humanity in Vince. No, you find a way to dislike him even more.
It actually reminds you of all the bad things because, like, a lot, like we knew about the Julian Grant thing right now. We know about that lawsuit, and we know about the Ashley Mazzaro incident because that's so telling. Because someone actually took their lives, and then it's come to light that she blames what happened to her in that company. That played a major role, but I've heard about the female referee. I completely forgot about it until this special. Like, you hear about this type of stuff and you're just like, man, this is crazy. Like, some of this stuff. And then, you know what I found very telling? That, like, for some reason it's just not talked about. And I was curious, Tyler, why don't you give me your thoughts on this? How many of the divas and women did Vince, like, make out with during his time in the, like, they showed almost every single time he made out with one of these women. How is that possibly storytelling?
I had a political science teacher once that used to say, you write the rules, you win the game.
Okay.
So that would be my response to that. Vince is writing the rules, so he wins the game.
Like, I watched this man make out with Tori Wilson, with Sable, with Trish, with who is the Stacy Keibler. I'm just thinking, like,
Candice Michelle.
Candice Michelle, like, these are, it was like, what did this, like, the thing is, like, you can say Katie Vick and I can put myself to that casket. I can remember the scene. Like, you tell me the hand with Mae Young and Mark Henry, and I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that. I remember all of it. I remember Triple H in the casket. I remember all of this stuff, like, vividly. I remember, I don't, for the life of me, remember why Vince, what was the story for him to need to make out with all these women. Now, I understood the Trish one. The Trish one made sense because he left his wife for Trish. That was like the story and everything.
There were like variations of that story, though, that they told a bunch of different times where they would be like his personal assistant or whatever.
Well,
yeah.
Well, again, I think that what we start seeing in at least episode 2, as we're moving on also into the other episodes, we start seeing the seeds being planted about how damaged Vince is as a person. And again, let me be very clear. I'm not a clinician. That's some of my graduate degrees are in, but I can tell you from working in the criminal justice system for 10 years before transitioning into academia and journalism respectively, I can tell you that, by Vince's own admission, internalizing trauma like he has, whether it's the abuse at the hands of his stepfather, whether it's the incidents of incest at the hands of his mother, which he again came clean about in a Playboy interview.
Yeah.
I think that there's a certain internalization of what Vince lived through. And I think that projecting that outwards into a guy that is the head of a company. And again, let's be very clear that at a time when TNA was not a viable option or competitor, it never really was per se, but it was an alternative. Vince understood that he was the only game in town. You were not going, unless you really needed to, you were not going to fly halfway across the world and go to New Japan or go to Mexico at AAA.
Yep.
Vince knew he was the only game in town. And Vince knew that I think that if you were going to work in a company, and again, this is a very different time too, where women went from the eye candy valets into trying to be workers to, let's be honest, it's nowhere near. Listen, you go back 20 years to Survivor Series 2002, a hardcore match between Trish Stratus and Victoria. That's a very different match. And those are two workers that got better. It's not even comparable 20 years later when we're watching Rhea Ripley and Charlotte Flair headline a WrestleMania. Yeah. So I think that, Vince knew that he kind of had them at his mercy.
Can you repeat that?
What's that?
Can you repeat that? What'd you say about Rhea? And
well, I think, the idea of going from 2000, again, and I was there in Survivor Series 2002, seeing Trish Stratus defend the women's championship against Victoria in a hardcore match. And again, it's a hardcore match. And there were workers that have improved infinitely.
Yeah.
Think about 20 years later to where, women are headlining WrestleMania like Rhea and Charlotte Flair. It's a very different time for the women, right?
They didn't headline WrestleMania.
That's how people view it, Tyler. Fuck yourself. That's exactly.
I mean, that's what it was. And the idea that Rhea's probably not going to keep headlining WrestleManias is foolhardy because she's going to keep headlining them. She's that old and that hot of a neck. But getting back to the way Vince perceived women on the roster, I think that a lot of the women knew that this is the only game in town. They're going to have to acquiesce to Vince in some capacity. Listen, we're never going to really learn about where Vince's transgressions, how far they went with either Trish, Candice Michelle, Victoria, Jazz, Lita, Ivory. You take your pick. Again, I think there's a way that we learned that Vince internalized a lot of trauma, and over the years he projected it in the way, let's be honest, the way he presented women from eye candy to workers, but still in a very provocative, very revealing way. Let's be honest, watch some of those matches during the Attitude Era into the Ruthless Aggression Era. Women didn't leave a lot to be desired in terms of their attire. This isn't Saudi Arabia in some, backwards part of the world where they're covered from head to toe. We're talking about very scantily dressed women attempting to work. Vince took advantage of that. And we may never learn what Vince did to a lot of women. We've learned what he did to some women in wrestling, but we may never really learn. Again, I think there's some people who just take it to the grave. They're going to be, listen, Trish Stratus is very grateful to Vince. Trish made millions of dollars because of it. And a lot of
she definitely did not come on. She was definitely a Vince supporter in this.
Yes. And maybe Vince mistreated her. Vince maybe mistreated Lita and Tori Wilson and a whole bunch of other women. We're never going to know about that. We've only learned about, unfortunately, Ashley Massaro's incident while away, on an army base, the female referee, I think that maybe the female ring announcer. And to say nothing of the fact, too, that over the years we've learned about Pat Patterson and other pedophiles that were ring crew that, that let's be honest. Again, I don't want to go to this level, but there's a level of Joe Paterno-esque behavior in Vince that allowed the Sandusky's behind the scenes to sort of permeate right? Ring crew.
So are you saying that you agree with Tony Atlas, that you feel like Pat Patterson was he was a part of the problem as well? Because it feels like he's kind of alone there. It feels like I've never heard anybody say anything about Pat except for Tony Atlas.
Well, we've learned, right, that I think there was an announcer, I think in the 80s, that had gone on Donahue, right, that had confronted Vince. Amari Hutchins, I think his name is, correct me if I'm wrong, I think maybe that's the name. But I think that the point was that, Vince had a lot of trust and faith in Pat Patterson. There was a point where I think Pat Patterson had to leave the company briefly because of, I think, the bad exposure. Listen, did Vince enable a lot of bad behavior behind the scenes? Maybe. I think we're learning that he did, aside from his own bad behavior. But again, I don't want to just crucify Vince here. Again, I'm not perfect. I'm a human being. I've had, I've had some serious transgressions with women, not to this extent, obviously. But what I'm saying is that, listen, I haven't been the best to women in my adult life. I think there's plenty of ex-girlfriends that will tell you Fernando was a fucking asshole and that he was a womanizer and that his vice isn't alcohol or drugs, because I don't do them, but his vice is pussy. Is Vince the first guy to fall victim to pussy? No, and he's not going to be the last guy. But unfortunately, whether it's Vince or people that are now in the public eye, like Sean Combs, that are being accused of trafficking women, it's a sad state of affairs.
Yeah, I agree. What about you, Tyler? What'd you think there?
Well, the only thing that I would add is I had always heard a couple of different things. There's a lot of people that don't believe the ref story. When it happened, there's a lot of people that said that they felt like that she was put up to it by someone. I don't know who that would be.
Rival promoters?
No, I think it was those shows. What was the show she went on? Geraldo?
Oh, by Donahue, by Geraldo. You're saying that those people put her up to it.
That she was paid to do that and to make those accusations. Now I don't know. Obviously, I wasn't there, but I just know a lot of people think that. I'm just stating what I've read. And the same with a lot of people didn't think Pat was actually involved with the ring crew thing. He just left because of the look, basically, and that's why he was brought back. Because
he was a homosexual.
Because it was a bad look. Yeah.
Because it was a bad look to employ a homosexual.
No, because they're the accusations.
Oh, because he grabbed Tony Atlas's wiener.
Well, again, I think also too there's been allegations about ring crews, and I think one of the announcers was behind that, and whether or not Pat Patterson turned a blind eye. Again, I mean, there's elements that almost make you think like Vince had a certain Joe Paterno-esque influence by allowing some behaviors backstage, whether it was Patterson or others. Again, it's not. Listen, this is 2024. It's 1984. 40 years ago, the ability for people to come out of the closet and then be an open homosexual, I think, is very different. I think whether it's men or women, that flexibility or that tolerance probably wasn't. And I'm sure the boys in the locker room kind of maybe had an idea of who was gay and who wasn't, but that wasn't talked about openly. I think you just kind of went to work. But if there were people that were predatory, I think we learned about that. Again, I don't want to sort of put all the onus on Vince. I think that there's a lot of blame to go around, whether or not people like Pat Patterson were complicit. Others, listen, let's be honest about the road agents at that time. Tony Gurria, Rene Goulet. I mean, there's a lot of road agents that we're not going to hear about because either they're dead or they're not talking.
Yeah. I mean, another thing that I really I found interesting was almost like Vince wouldn't even give credit to Eric Bischoff for like his success. You know what I mean? It felt very much like he just really felt like he was only successful because he just kind of, I don't know, I would say like because he used his talent. You know what I mean? Like I thought that was a really interesting thing. So, I mean, but another thing that I found that was really interesting was the fact that we moved on to the Montreal Screwjob. and we talked about like the Wendy Richter thing. We talk about the Montreal screw job and stuff like that, and it feels like that was such a prevalent thing. Like it wasn't like a it wasn't like they didn't feel like it didn't need done. And I don't know, when I look back to it and stuff, like I think that Brett didn't deserve what happened to him, and I still feel that way to this day. I feel like the word loyalty, I guess, matters to certain people more than others, and I know that there's a difference between business and personal. But I think when you run a company that people leave your company and you still put them through Alcoholics Anonymous, and you pay for I think when you run a company that, like, when you're willing to pay for people's like substance abuse like issues, when you run a company where you're willing to take care of your right hand man's wife as she's dying, when you're willing to help a wrestler like a Ric Flair kind of like jump out of bankruptcy and give him money, like I think you are shedding the whole like business and pleasure thing. So it's proving that you believe that business and personal can be mixed. So when I see that, and I see that Vince has that side of him, that's why I believe that to this day, Bret Hart will never forgive him for the Montreal screw job, because he's shown a side of him where he's willing to take care of people, where he's willing to do stuff for other people. I mean, even like when was that John Moxley?
He did. He helped Brett get his deal in WCW.
Well, let me say this, because I know that the documentary covers a little bit about what happened in Montreal, and I think we've dissected it when we've done shows before. I'm gonna plant the flag. I'm gonna die on this hill. I'm as big a Bret Hart fan as there is. There's a reason why I love wearing pink since I was a teenager. It's because of Bret Hart. Bret revolutionized that. I think Bret was a guy that was a tremendous, I think, example as a worker and as a guy, again, coming out of a period where steroids and this and that. Bret made it, let's be honest, Bret made it cool to like pro wrestling, to like wrestling. Having said that, listen, when Bret lost to Shawn at WrestleMania 12 in April of 96 in Anaheim, he took that break, and then his contract subsequently was up that summer. And Bischoff, we've all heard the stories. Bischoff flew to LA because he was filming an episode of Lonesome Dove, et cetera, et cetera. And, he went back to Vince. Vince knew that, hey, I lost these guys. I can't lose Bret either. And I think what we saw with Vince was an insistence. Again, Vince flew listen, if you know anything about flying out of JFK Airport to fly to Calgary, it's about a 6-hour flight. I don't care if it is a private plane. 6 hours is 6 hours on a plane, folks. Okay, so it's not comfortable. Having said that, Vince knew how important Bret was, and when Bret decided to resign, one of the provisions of that contract was, hey, by the way, there's this Canadian film company that wants to do a documentary on me. I want you to have full access to it. And sure enough, that's how we got Wrestling with Shadows. Yeah, I find it hard to believe to this day that that documentary, whatever revisions it goes through, that Vince didn't have a say in how that was presented and how it was produced. And the idea going into, listen, Vince wanted to get to Bret to Shawn at Montreal in November. We learned over the summer, and I was there at SummerSlam '97. I was there live watching that, when Bret beat The Undertaker for his 5th championship. And
as he should have. He's better.
Yeah, great moment. And what we learned is pretty much going into that fall that Vince came with the, hey, I can't really afford you. Let's see what we can do, et cetera, et cetera. Well, listen, there were months where Vince could have taken the title off of him at a house show, on a pay-per-view, whatever. He chose not to. He felt, hey, let's get to Montreal. Let's have, Bret Shawn over. Whether or not the dislike between Bret and Shawn was a work or not, who knows? Maybe it blurs the lines a little bit. But the bottom line was that Vince felt like, listen, look what's happened with other people leaving. Look what's happened. And again, I firmly believe that Brett would not have taken that title belt to Nitro. I think Brett was a guy that respected the business. I think he's a guy that understood, like, hey, there's a certain prestige, and he wasn't going to do that. I think Vince, felt that Brett is too much of a liability right now. I didn't like what was done either. But let's be fair. Yes, he's at ringside. Yes, Pritchard's in Gorilla. Yes, Pritchard claims he didn't know what was going to go on. But look at the camera angles. Again, and to quote the late, great Scott Hall from the Dark Side episode, you mean to tell me that the way that certain still shots are produced, the idea of Brett going and spitting at, at Vince at that moment. Only 2 years later, when Owen fell to his death, which again comes up in the documentary too, obviously they were smart in knowing how to take the camera shots away from there, to make sure that the home audience didn't know what was going on, and to some extent, the live audience. Again, Vince, I think, had a hand in how that was produced. I think it was a little bit of a work. And at the end of the day, and here's my academic hat I'm putting on right now. At the end of everything happening, they're in the locker room. We're going to hear a million different versions of what happened in the locker room. Brett took a shower. Brett took an hour. Vince sat there. I can't imagine Vince sitting in the dressing room for an hour waiting for Brett to wash his ass. Okay. Brett and Vince tangled up. Brett uppercut him. Brett okay, you saw the shiner. In what world?
Fucking uppercut.
In what world is an attorney not going to tell Vince, hey, by the way, this guy assaulted you? I get it that he signed and whatever, something happened, whatever, but this guy assaulted you. We all know how petty Vince can be. We've seen it over the years. At what point in time did an attorney not go up to Vince that we know of and say, hey, if you want to have this guy arrested for assault and B, sue him, you can do that. Guess what happened? Neither. So the idea, and this idea that Vince, well, I'm going to give him a shot. No, folks. I'm not going to, I don't care if I screwed you in whatever way possible. I'm not going to let you take a physical shot at me in a room full of witnesses and then all of a sudden turn around and be like, you know what? Shit, I could have this guy arrested. I could sue this guy. But what Vince did was, you know what? What happened. He's going off to WCW. And there was a part of Vince that said, this guy's the hottest act in wrestling. He's a martyr. He's the ultimate babyface victim. And what happened? Well, we all know the rest is history. Bischoff squandered that popularity for Bret Hart.
Yeah.
Had him referee a match at Starrcade. And the rest is history about Bret Hart and WCW. But you're not going to convince me that Bret, Vince, and Shawn don't have some agreement they'll take to the grave about Montreal being a work shoot.
But you want to know the worst part about that? You want to know the worst part about you saying that? Let's say, for just the sake of this argument, that everything you just said there is 100% factual. That, God forbid, one of these guys passes away and we find out that the Montreal Screwjob was a work, right? Do you know who suffered the most because of this work shoot? Bret Hart. Because there are idiots like this guy over here who absolutely hate Bret Hart because of the Montreal Screwjob, that are still angry at him, that feel like, why couldn't he just do business? So this is why
couldn't he just do his job?
Do you see what I'm saying? This guy, it's like the dumbest shit I've ever heard.
Well, but Macho, I think what Tyler is symptomatic of is, again, what we've learned about the business because of books, because of podcasts, because of shoot interviews. And again, I think Bret looks at himself as someone that, like, hey, I gave 20 years of my life to this guy.
Yes.
Again, all I asked was certain things. And let's be honest. Isn't it funny that Vince inserts in the contract, hey, in your last 30 days of employment, you have reasonable creative control? Does that not ring an alarm bell in any of your heads at home, folks?
Yeah.
Vince,
I mean, Kevin said it all the time.
What does reasonable creative control mean?
No, it doesn't mean anything.
What is reasonable?
No, exactly. So I think that Vince for a while already thought like, I can't lose Brett, but I also want to insulate myself too, because you never know what's going to happen. And again, you don't put that. Who puts that in a provision if you're not already thinking 3 or 4 moves ahead about what
But
you
the-
think of this guy?
The
So
thing about Vince that I learned during this documentary is that he is a. I want to be very clear the way I say this, so I don't come off as like a complete fool. He is a world-class hypocrite. There are moments like you mentioned about the WCW stuff, right? There are moments where he talks about wrongdoings that happened to him, like Eric Bischoff stealing his, like, yeah, it was Scott Hall, but that was Razor Ramon's character.
yeah.
Oh, Hogan told me he would never go to WCW. He would never screw me like that. Then he goes over there. There are moments where he actually sheds light onto how much this affected him. It hurt him. Even though, guess what? Those guys are just doing business. It's just business.
Yeah.
But when it comes to another man that told him, I gave you 15 years of my fucking career, and I was here when you needed to put somebody at the top over the steroid era, he's like, nah. See, that Hogan and Scott Hall stuff, that wasn't right because it happened to me. But this is okay because fuck you, you're Canadian.
Well, Mach, you know what? That's a good point. And I would add to that I think that, listen, Brett comes across forever as the most sympathetic babyface in this situation. Now, I understand Tyler's point about, listen, are there people that will take it to the grave and say Brett should have done business? Brett should have been amicable to his employer. I get all that. I understand the premise. Again, I can look at it from every angle. The problem is the optic of Vince trying to play victim here and say, well, Brett was holding me over a barrel. Vince held people over a barrel for decades. So the idea that I think Vince wants to have this manufactured fake outrage, a lot of people aren't buying it. Case in point, you, Mach, you're not buying it. I think a lot of people don't buy it either. Now, again, I think that we're never going to really know what the conversations were behind the scenes. Could Vince have taken the belt off of Brett before? Sure. He could have been like, he could have lost it to Taker. He could have lost it, not Austin yet, because Austin was getting hot after he beat Owen, but he wasn't WrestleMania, 14 hot yet, right?
Yeah,
so
no.
I think that, Vince was a little bit of a pickle. How do we get the belt off of Brett as he's leaving? Mm-hmm. And then obviously, we get to Montreal, we get to see what happens. And I think at the end of the day, like, listen, we look at the way it was produced. I think that Vince wanted this out there. I think, again, the documentary doesn't get made. Okay, Wrestling with Shadows doesn't get released. And I'm sure Vince is shrewd as hell. He has good attorneys. I'm sure he said, okay, well, yes, Brett has complete say about the documentary, but I still want to have a look at the final cut before it hits theaters or hits DVDs. Let's be honest. Vince didn't mind that leaking out to the public about what happened with Montreal. The idea that he didn't know Brett was wearing a wire and all that. Listen, this is all bullshit. I think I think Vince knew what he was doing. I think you still feel bad for Brett because what ended up happening to Brett is
people feel bad.
He had the hottest momentum going into another company. And again, Bischoff squandered it. I don't want to put all the blame on Bischoff. Whoever was running creative, whether it was Dusty Rhodes or whoever else, squandered an opportunity with Bret Hart as the hottest baby face in the business. But also too, Vince, I think, saw the writing on the wall. He saw that Austin was the big money maker to come up. He knew Shawn still had some time left.
Yeah.
I think he saw the rise of Triple H to some extent, saw the rise of Shamrock. Taker was still over. Kane was getting very super over, right? I think Vince said, you know what? I can afford to lose Brett, and I'm not going to, because let's be honest, just 2 months later, after telling Brett to his face on the phone, listen, I can't afford you. Mysteriously, he finds money to pay the rights fee to have Mike Tyson appear at the Rumble.
Yeah.
And it was like, by the way, that's not a couple $100,000. That's
no, that was millions.
Millions of dollars. So,
it's really funny you say that because some of the things that stuck out to me were like the things that weren't mentioned. So here's some of the things that really stuck out to me about this documentary. Undertaker's a yes man. Like, that's how he comes off. Like he will do or say anything for Vince. But you want to know why that's so telling? Why I thought that was so important to bring up on our podcast? Find me the clip where Undertaker says Brett should have done business.
That's it for Tyler. Are you okay? You look like Mike Francesa there. Are you dozing off on us here? Or
Nah, he normally gets
no,
quiet.
I'm just waiting. I just have so many things to say.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I mean, listen, I think Mark Calloway, listen, the reason he's a millionaire, the reason he got to marry Michelle McCool, I think the reason that he has arguably the best longevity of a gimmick ever in the history of pro wrestling, next to Ric Flair, probably, in terms of longevity. I think Mark Calloway looks at what happened with Brett, and there's a part of him that feels for him. But I think at the same time, too, he
was willing to beat up Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania 14.
But
so this is why I know this is why I know that Brett was done dirty, because Taker was willing. He told us the story. It's still, Tyler, that story pisses you off, right?
Yeah,
you don't
because
like that
Shawn
story.
apparently Shawn didn't want to do business with Steve. But Steve clearly was on the trajectory upwards, and Steve was the future.
That's exactly my point.
Yeah,
that's my point. The fact that Taker would go out there and tell the world in an interview in a time where he didn't do interviews like that. This isn't like his new thing. He told people that a while ago. I was wrapping my fists and stuff because I know Tyler has complained about that quote for a lot. He's told me how much he hates it, right? He's also complained about Vader being he's also complained about Vader being too rough with Shawn Michaels. My point is,
remember, Shawn was in a bad place. I think that
no, I get that. That's not what I'm saying.
And he never said he wasn't going to do business. He said, "Get me security, or I'm not coming," because he got hit by batteries the day before.
Oh, shut up! You never been to Yankee Stadium? Listen. So then, what I'm going to say, what I'm saying is like,
really, they're rowdy. They're rowdy degenerates in that shithole city. Come on.
Yeah. Stop. So listen, what I'm going to say is like the reason that I think this is so important is because Taker put himself on the line by telling us that Shawn Michaels story, but yet there is no evidence out there of him saying Brett should have done business. He told us Shawn had to do business, but he's never said. That's what I agree. Taker Mark
Calloway has said openly, it bothered me that I didn't know what was going on in Gorilla. Now again, Vince protected a lot of people. He protected Bruce against himself. I think Vince protected a lot of people because at the end of the day, listen, the less people that know, the better. And I think that was Vince's rationale about like it's Brett, it's Shawn, it's Earl Hebner, it's who else? I think the agents, Pat Patterson, Gerald Briscoe. Again, keep that circle small.
They didn't tell Pat.
God. I just had a thought based on this entire conversation.
Okay.
Tyler, just hear me out for a second. Let's say Fernando is absolutely correct. This is all a work, right?
Well, some extent.
Hold on. All right. Yeah. So let's say that the Montreal Screwdriver's a work, right? And we've had this conversation where we've kind of been like, I hope it's a work or whatever, one of those things. What if that's why Brett's bitter? Because he knows it was a work and he's taken the blame since 97. What if that's why he's still bitter? Because he knows I took this to my grave. I told him I would take this to my grave. And he is a wrestling loyalist. He's never going to throw anybody. If he made a pact, he's keeping that pact. So let's say that this is a work. But it backfired, and instead of gaining sympathy for Brett, it actually made people like you feel like, dude, you should have just done fucking business. This is stupid.
Yeah, but
that's his whole bitterness.
If that were the case, he wouldn't have gone to WCW and not cared and phoned it in. And
I think Tyler, that's not true. I mean, that's unfair to.
He's admitted that he did it.
Well, okay,
yeah, he said he did.
He's admitted that, but he also went in with the perspective of like, okay, well, I'm the hottest guy in wrestling right now.
Yes.
I'm a martyr. Let's see what happens. And what did Bischoff do? Bischoff literally had him referee a match at Starrcade. And then literally 2 months later, a guy that he has absolutely loathed for years. They pair him with Hulk Hogan in the New World Order. It just didn't make any sense. I get he was getting paid, but I think there was an element of Brett that I think that was resentful being there. And then to compound the problem, which the documentary covers again as we're moving on within the episodes. The incident with Owen in '99.
I got some stuff to say before we get there.
And I'll say this. I'll plant the flag and I'll die on this hill about this. That is one of the dynamics that I will never forgive Vince for. Because again, it's the idea that
me and Pat were watching that show when it happened.
Wrestlers were going to the ring seeing bloodstains on the apron. The idea that there were people in Gorilla as Owen is being carted off. And at that point, he was dead. There's no resuscitation. He was dead. Yeah. He's being carted off, and Vince is being like, all right, you're next. The idea of now again, the home crowd didn't really know what happened. The live crowd didn't know really what happened either.
We knew because Jim Ross told us.
Now, the idea of the visual, yeah, you're right. Jerry Lawler and obviously, Jim Ross had the unfortunate circumstance of reporting that live during the broadcast. But I think the premise I think fans would have understood to stop that. And I think that it reminds people, I get it. Vince was still in that competitive mode. He was worried about WCW. But let's be honest, by May of '99, WWF already pulled ahead already of WCW. I think we already had seen that.
Yeah, their champion was Stone Cold Steve Austin.
Yeah, and he was super hot and over after WrestleMania in Philadelphia. I just think that the entire incident with Owen, I think the unnecessary risks that he subjected Owen Hart to, and I'm not going to go with, he was mad at Brett, so he's taking. No, I don't believe that nonsense. Marks have these conspiracy theories. I just think that optic look makes him look bad because it's like, yo, what you decide to do as wrestlers are in the ring, they're looking at the apron, they're seeing blood. That's Owen Hart's blood after his neck.
I think Brett hates him because of that death, because he embarrassed Owen. He made him go back to the comic book character of the Blue Blazer instead of having him as a normal person. But I'll be honest with you, Eric Bischoff made the same mistake that Bruce Pritchard made in WrestleMania 8. He just didn't see value in Brett. He said it so many times. Tyler, how many times has he said on that podcast, I didn't see value in him. I just didn't think he was great. That's what Bruce Pritchard did.
Why are you blaming Bruce Pritchard for WrestleMania 8? Like, it wasn't him.
Because he said it. Because he's the guy came out of his lips.
He was part of the creative team.
But if so,
he doesn't make the decisions.
But he said it. Like it's like it's not like it's
he said it, but he is not the
person.
Okay. But you don't think Vince makes that decision? Like,
no.
But Vince, I'm sorry, Bischoff had to see some value in Brett. Where I get it,
he did when he was the champion.
Well, no, hold on. If you remember correctly, during the summer of '96, when he was off TV after losing to Shawn, he was a hot free agent. So it's like, I get it. He wants to stick it to Vince to take one more guy away.
Bischoff denies that, by the way.
Yeah, he denies going after Brett.
Well,
he has vehemently denied it on his podcast.
Who? What you mean, Bischoff?
Yeah, he says he never had a meeting with Brett. He never talked to Brett. Nothing. He you have to listen to this interview. There's a Bret Hart episode.
I mean, listen, is Bischoff also trying
I love that one so much.
Well, listen, is Bischoff also trying to cover his ass too? I mean, listen, let's not kid ourselves about what we've learned about Eric Bischoff, right? I mean, listen, the death of WCW documentary on Vice didn't do him any favors. Yeah. I think that there is some damage control that Bischoff will always engage in because, again, there's an element to him that there's a legacy component to Eric Bischoff that he never wants to lose. So if he wants to go down that rabbit hole and say, well, that's just not true. I mean, obviously he went to LA to see Brett. He kept, contacting Brett. He
lost already, man. He lost. The moment AEW passes, the Dynamite passes Nitro, he lost. And you know why he lost? Because AEW Dynamite is a fucking terrible show. And in this day and age, it's like it's the Jerry Springer shit. That's what it is when you watch it. It's car crash TV. I can't tell the difference between a Vince Russo produced wrestling segment and AEW.
Well, you know what? I don't disagree with that one.
And it works nowadays. Well, and it works.
I don't disagree with that premise. And I know that I can tell Tyler's about to have a stroke after that comment. But the thing about Bischoff, though, is that Bischoff found value in Brett. He was willing to pay him as much as he was paying Scott Hall and Kevin Nash. Maybe not Hogan.
Yeah.
but he was
Yeah,
willing.
I mean,
So the idea that Bischoff maybe now wants to save face and say, well, no, that's just not true. Because because he knows deep down Brett can just pull out, documents, emails, faxes.
What he says
yeah.
is that they were making them do Thunder, and he was going to need more talent.
Mhm,
So he bit the bullet, even though he didn't really want to.
mhm. Yeah, he almost like never saw anything in Brett anymore.
So
Brett had
a couple of
value.
things. A couple of things about why I think Brett should have done business and why they did what they did. I don't think anyone ever believed that Bret Hart was going to show up on Nitro and throw the belt in the trash, blah, blah, blah. But Eric Bischoff was going to open Nitro the following night before Raw started and announce that they had signed the WWF champion. And then Bret wanted to walk out and give up the belt. So you're telling me in what they're calling a war that you should have just let your champion let the competition announce that they signed him, and B, let him just give up the belt and go there as if no one could beat him?
Yes.
You're telling me that's good business?
Yes.
You're out of your mind.
That's great business for
Wasn't
both
the
companies.
Nitro? Wasn't the night after Survivor Series? Wasn't that the Nitro where the entire NWO came out with? Canadian
So that's what they ended up doing because he had lost the title, but he punched out Vince.
Yeah.
Okay, but
so they came out and they say, he passed the initiation, blah blah blah.
Okay,
Canada.
So basically, that was just the announcement of like they signed Bret Hart, right? I mean, again, I don't remember that Nitro verbatim, but I think
But if he had been the champion and they had opened the show before Raw starts saying, "Oh yeah, we signed the champion," and then he walks out and gives up the belt as if no one could beat him for it, that doesn't hurt WWF.
Yeah.
but Brett wasn't. But yeah, okay. Correct me if I'm wrong here, dates wise. Brett had signed the new deal with WCW, but wasn't there a premiere date, and that wasn't going to be the next night after Survivor Series?
No, he was not going to walk out. I'm saying Bischoff was going to open the show saying he had signed him.
Yeah.
Then Brett was going to start Raw, come out and relinquish the championship.
Yep.
Okay.
I don't understand what's wrong with that.
You don't understand.
You said all brilliant stuff. What's the problem?
When you're going head to head with the competition, you don't understand why it would be a problem for them to announce that they have signed your champion, and then for him to come and give you your belt back because no one can beat him for it. You don't see how that could hurt your company.
Well, no. Tyler, to your point, I mean, I think about the optic about Brett. I think at the end of the day, the reason that Brett's story resonates with people still 30 years later is because I think that there's a perception about what Brett represented, right? Like an employee standing up to his employer who felt marginalized, who felt that his value wasn't, observed by his employer. I think that, listen, the very same reason that
That's
Austin
interesting.
McMahon, no, hear me out. The reason I think that Austin McMahon resonated with so many people is because people looked at that from a voyeuristic perspective of like, hey, an employee hating his boss. I think they looked at Brett as the employee that was very giving to a company, and then his employer milked as much out of that cow as possible. And then, listen, to quote him from Wrestling with Shadows, it's kind of like, the racehorse or the circus animal, once you outlive your usefulness, take you out back, put a slug in you, and you're done. And I think that that's the perspective that Brett had as an employee, that, hey, my employer, yes, milked me for everything he could. And when I came at him with what I thought was reasonable, requests upon the end of my employment, my employer didn't want to give that to me when I was so accommodating to him.
Again,
he acts like it was volunteer work.
Again, listen, it's pro wrestling. No one's saying this is the same as corporate America. If you work for Wells Fargo or Merrill Lynch or Goldman Sachs, no one's saying that. But I think that people conceptualize it as, hey, here's just an employee who gave so much of his life in a business where you're working so many days a year, you're not seeing your kids grow up, you're missing birthdays, quinceañeras. I don't even know they have quinceañeras in fucking Canada. But the point is that,
never mind.
Whatever.
Nah.
The point is that I think that the reason his story resonates with people is because Brett is looked upon as a regular person who was marginalized by his employer. He stood up to his employer. His employer got the last laugh, or word per se, and cut his legs out from under him. And then there was a bad optic about Vince McMahon. And I think that people looked at Vince and said, again, at that point, kayfabe was basically almost gone. And I think you started seeing Vince being looked upon in a very negative light, which, to his credit, again, creatively, he turned it around and created the greatest heel in the history. Not Piper, not Hollywood Hogan, not Steve Austin, not Yokozuna, not Larry Zbyszko turning on Bruno Sammartino. The greatest heel in the history of this sport was Vince, was the evil Mr. McMahon. And I think that it all kind of worked out in his favor. But let's not kid ourselves that people don't look at Brett as a sympathetic figure, because then essentially what you're saying to me is that humanistically, that doesn't matter to you. And I think
then it doesn't matter to Tyler, because Tyler has told me time and time again he does not agree with anything like in terms of Brett.
Like he talks about oh, I was loyal to this company for however many years and blah blah blah. He acts like he's the only person that was loyal to them, that worked there, that did those sacrifices, and he acts like he did it for free or something. Like he wasn't handsomely compensated.
It sounds like
they didn't make him a big star.
Tyler, he was handsomely compensated. Vince did make him a star, but it doesn't negate the fact, again, humanistically speaking, that I think the reason people relate to Brett's story is because they look at Brett. And again, what happened to Wendy Richter, that if it wasn't the document, I would have forgotten about that. The reason that, again, in wrestling was at a peak where it was the infancy of the internet. We were seeing the dirt sheets rise. We were seeing more and more coverage about this. The reason it resonated is because it got so much mainstream attention. Listen, one of the shows I deeply miss on cable TV or the internet was Off the Record with Michael Landsberg. That was by far probably one of the best pro wrestling shows.
Is it not on anymore?
No, he ended, I think, in 2005. I think it was over. But from 97,
really?
okay. From 97 to 2000.
I loved it. I watched it every day.
97 to 2005, that was the show you wanted to watch about blurring the lines of pro wrestling. And what happened was he gave Brett a platform to say, I get it. Vince felt he needed to do this, but I also felt that as a worker, I need to do this to stand up for my brethren in the business. And again, if that doesn't resonate with you, God bless you. You're entitled to your opinion. But I think that people look at that and say, hey, there's a reason Brett's upset. And to Mach's point, I think that the bitterness, I think, is a conundrum of not being able to keep working and earning money after the injury to Goldberg. Listen, when WCW went out of business and a lot of those stars and their Time Warner contracts were expiring, and they started in 2002, maybe 03, 04, Brett was still at a position where he could have come back and still had some really good matches. We're never going to have Bret Hart and Kurt Angle. Not that Bret Hart at 40-something was but he was.
Whenever that match gets brought up a lot, and I always think to myself, but we were going to have hair Angle. We weren't going to have Wrestling Machine Angle. So we weren't going to have, like...
He got his head shaved in 2002.
Yeah, but we weren't going to have, like, that.
He was still recovering from the stroke. And again, had those things not happened to Brett, there's a very real possibility that after the Time Warner deals expired, that he could have come back in 02, 03, maybe, who knows, have those dream matches with Ben. Well, he already had it with Benoit, but have it with Angle, have it with Guerrero, maybe revisit Shawn. Who knows? Like, there's a lot of things that we're never going to see because of what happened. Yeah. But I think the idea that the reason people still to this day look at Brett in a sympathetic light is because they look at Vince as the promoter that was punitive, that was malicious towards Brett.
Malicious.
And that's why people have a hard time forgiving Vince for that. Because again, yes, you want to talk about doing business, whatever. Okay, that's fine. You're entitled to your opinion. But I think what gets lost here is that Vince went out of his way to try to bury Brett, to try to bury his legacy when he didn't have to. Again, he told Brett, I can't afford you. Go. The idea of Vince being petty And doing that to Brett again, and thankfully in 2006 when he came back, the DVD deal got struck because let's be honest, in 2002 when Vince McMahon produced the Self-Destruction of the Ultimate Warrior, that was an incredible burial job on Jim Hellwig. And Brett was
he did this type of shit. This is what I'm saying. Like Tyler,
and he was concerned that Vince was going to be that petty. What?
Yeah.
There isn't a precedent of Vince being petty.
Yeah,
Really?
it's like Tyler, you sit here and you're like, hey, you know what? Like Brett should have done business because like this guy made him a star and he should have just done it. But then like so you're saying he should have done business because it's a professional environment. You are paid to do a job, right? Because
Right.
it wouldn't have been good for the wrestling business, right? Do you think that the success of Bret the Hitman Hart as a whole for the wrestling business is good for the wrestling business? Let's say he did the job. Let's go from there.
Sure. Yeah.
The success of Bret the Hitman Hart, is it good for wrestling as a whole?
Okay.
So why bury him for like a couple months on your show then? Why do that?
Mach, look at your comments real quick. I'm sorry.
Like what? Like why bury him? Why bury him on your show then?
I think a lot of that may have been because he went to Meltzer.
We don't know that's certain.
He admits it.
I've never heard it, so it didn't happen.
It's in his book.
Maybe I'm not that far yet. Maybe I just skipped over it.
Okay. Yeah, no, he talks about it.
Yeah.
He said that was the one way he could get it out there, and he thinks that he bet that Vince didn't believe that he would ever do that. So they gambled that he wouldn't do that, so he had to do it to get the story out.
To give it to Meltzer.
Mm-hmm. He went to Meltzer and told him.
Well, I mean, he deserved it. Vince deserved everything that happened
But
to
why?
him.
Why could he not have just done what he was supposed to do?
Because he thought he had a great relationship with his boss, and his boss would never do something like that to him.
But regardless, if you have a great relationship with your boss, do what your boss says.
But a guy who had been screwed by his biggest star he ever made, he knows what it's like to be screwed like that.
But if he would just have done what was asked of him, it would never have happened.
I don't know. When I look at what Vince McMahon did as a whole, any sympathy I had towards him, I feel like it just kind of went out the window. And then every time that I see something else come out about Vince, this started the train for me. But the moment that I see like anything that happens like after this, I just always think to myself, yeah, it's just karma. Like you just keep getting busted, but this is what got the ball rolling. That's kind of how I feel about it.
Well,
so to get this clear, you think everything that happens to Vince is because he screwed Brett?
Yes. Yep.
Well, I'll say this, and I think there's an element of karma here. I think that applies to Vince because of not necessarily. I think. Listen, if you have to look at a bowl and look at the percentages of the ingredients in there, I would argue that I think Brett represents, believe it or not, in my opinion, a small percentage of the ingredients of the bowl, because I think the bigger ingredients here is the fact of how Vince did business, what behavior Vince engaged in. And I think, again, as we keep going through the documentary, we're learning, obviously, the indiscretions. We're learning about, obviously, the complicated relationship he had with his dad. Well, let's be honest, like that got projected onto Shane, right?
Yeah.
Where Shane, is a guy who really thought that he was going to be the heir apparent of the business. He really thought that, hey, in the pecking order, yes, him and Stephanie were going to, inherit the company, but Shane really felt that he was going to be that guy to succeed his dad, and that didn't happen. And then to compound the problem, I think there was an element of Vince that he got from his dad in the sense of not being as maybe warm or affectionate. Listen, for a lot of us who have dads that are super supportive and affectionate and endearing. Listen, I'll sort of personalize it this way. I love my dad to death. I would argue my dad is the smartest man I've ever met. And I would argue, the most noble man I've ever met too. But my dad, being old school Hispanic, is not very affectionate. My dad, I can count on one hand probably the amount of times that my dad has hugged me in a sort of very un-machismo sort of way when I graduated college, when I got my graduate degrees, when I got married. Like, it's very, I can count on one hand, but it doesn't negate the fact that my dad, I mean, loves me. My dad, there's nothing my dad wouldn't do for me. And I know that. And I have that really loving, healthy relationship with him. And I'm blessed by that. Shane doesn't have that. You can tell clearly that Shane is still jaded by the fact that his dad, I think, didn't give preferential treatment to him and Stephanie. They had to come up in the business, right? Stephanie had to market the t-shirts and model for the WWF magazine. Shane had to be part of ring crew, referee. Then he became an honor talent. Then he became physically involved in the industry. Like,
he was great at it.
And he was good. I think he was a lot better than all people give him credit for. I think it's a very sort of, you could see the agony in Shane as he's talking about his dad, where it took him basically having to jump off the Hell in a Cell in Dallas, Texas.
Yep.
And almost kill himself against Mark Calloway. And that's when you see Vince being as affectionate as possible to Shane, to a guy who got thrown through glass at the Meadowlands in King of the Ring 2001. I was there for that. You could hear the glass shatter up in the upper level. Okay. You could see, Shane taking a beating there. Shane put his body through a lot for the business.
The test bump, getting hit with the kendo stick and falling back. Yeah.
Test bump. But
I mean, Shane McMahon's a better wrestler than Will Ospreay, and people don't even give him credit for it.
Shane took a lot for the business, but he took all that punishment because he was so eager to win the approval of his dad that, let's be honest, it could have killed him. So I think that's another tragic element about this relationship, where Vince didn't get that real sort of fatherly love from his dad. Yeah. And I think that maybe didn't convey that to Shane either. Not because Shane has made money. He's, away from WWE right now. Yeah. He's a self-made man. He's made money. He's invested in companies. He clearly doesn't need wrestling right now. Who knows? Yeah. Maybe Tony Khan brings on. Who knows? But the point is that
he'll fix that company right away because he'll get Will Ospreay off TV.
That's another tragic. That's another tragic dynamic, I think, of what this documentary represents, is the breakdown of the family between Vince and Linda, between Vince and Stephanie, and Vince and Shane. It's a very complex family, and I think there's a level of toxicity that I don't think we ever really talk about when it comes to the McMahons.
No. Tyler, do you have something to say before we wrap up here? I think we're just going to stop at episode 3 since we're about to hit that 2-hour mark, and we'll see when Mr. Fernando can give us another time, and then we can come on and talk the other 3 episodes. So Fernando, we'll bend the knee to your schedule, sir.
Let me know. I mean, again, just keep messaging me, and again, we can work something out for sure. But
yeah.
But Tyler, I'm curious. I mean, you've been very quiet. It looks like you're watching the 600,000 number on the Nielsen ratings on Thursday morning. Talk to me. What you seem?
He's just upset because I hit a nerve, because I'm right. Shane McMahon is just a better.
I just really hope that Okada retires Danielson tomorrow night. And
well, yeah, I mean, it's fine. Brian's going to retire soon anyway. So
other than that,
Cody.
Other than that, I did have with the Angle match with Shane. Was it throwing him through the first time or throwing him back through where the glass wouldn't break?
I think, listen, that match was brutal to watch. Your heart goes out to Shane for what. Never mind Angle. Angle fractured his tailbone in that entire sequence. But
what I'm saying is, there was one point where the glass wouldn't break and Shane just kept crashing into it, and Vince
he had to call him a pussy.
Vince was yelling at Gorilla for them to stop doing it.
Well, yeah, but then what happened?
Because he was concerned.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
I don't know if Shane ever found out about that, but that's something Bruce has told us.
But again, it's a reminder that Shane put his body, and I think to some extent, some of his soul into the business, because he knows that's what his dad wanted.
Yeah.
And I think that again, that's a tragic element about what this documentary on Netflix told us, right? I mean, never mind. I mean, obviously, next episode we'll talk about Stephanie and we'll talk about Linda, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think Shane is a microcosm of is that D? That's gotta be D, I think, right?
That is definitely D. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining
also,
us, D.
we did have a question earlier that in the chat that I think we kind of missed. Someone asked about Benoit, whether they feel it's right that they're erasing him, and I gotta, there it is right there. And I gotta say, as much as I'm a fan of the guy, like his in-ring work, I don't think they have a choice as a, publicly. Are they still publicly traded?
Yeah.
Oh, the TKOs, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
As a publicly traded company, I don't think they really have a choice. It sucks, but it's just something that no corporation is gonna take the
I mean, there are people that have tried their best not to excuse what Benoit did, but to explain it. Like, I believe what Christopher Nowinski did.
Yes.
Finding out like everything he did.
Great dynamic of the documentary with Chris Nowinski. I love.
Yeah, I mean, he really tried his best. We'll definitely delve into that because we need to talk about Stone Cold saying he doesn't believe in CTE. That was a kind of a weird quote.
Well, again, I mean, just to harp on that point again, Steve Austin wrestled a very different style than Chris Benoit. So the idea that Steve Austin was not headbutting people from the top of cages. Steve Austin was not running through the ropes and getting hit with a chair shot point blank by Chris Jericho. Yeah. Like Steve Austin was a guy that was a safe worker and learned over the years how to take chair shots, safely. Now, again, I don't want to be one of those guys that watches Instagram, and we've all seen it, right? Where that's the moment. That's what did it for Benoit. The Benoit thing, what I felt, and to this day, it's 17 years later, it's crazy to think, right? But I really liked the inclusion of Chris Nowinski into the documentary because I think Chris Nowinski again represents a really holistic dynamic about how wrestling changed for the better. Unfortunately, due to the Benoit tragedy. Okay. Yeah. And what's scary, again, you go back and you read about Chris Nowinski's old problems with his concussions. And by the way, very underrated gimmick. I thought that Harvard.
Oh yeah, the Harvard gimmick was great.
I thought that was very underrated. I think Chris Nowinski was a good worker, good on the microphone. It's a shame that character never took off more. Again, concussions obviously cut his career short.
I mean, we need to look at him in the same light as like an Andrew Luck or a Chris Borland. Not saying that he's as dynamic as those two players are. Obviously, Luck being like the best of the three, but all three of those men all made decisions to leave their sport due to injury. With Borland being
who was the last guy?
Chris Borland, the linebacker, and
I remember.
Yeah,
and what's interesting about Nowinski is that you look at what the advancements have been in research with CTE, right? Like, I mean, again, just put this in perspective. And I don't want to harp on this long because we could talk about the next episode, but you think about the amount of brain damage he suffered that at the time of his death, after his death, obviously Chris Nowinski reached out to the Benoit family and they dissected his brain.
Yeah.
And when they put it through the microscope, think about a healthy brain and you saw the CAT scan.
Yeah.
Right? You saw the CAT scan and the black that you saw on the right side of the brain, because again, for anyone that isn't aware, the right side of the brain is the cognitive part, which deals with your motor functions, right? The left side of the brain is, the creative side of the brain, right? The visual cortex is on the right side. So when you look at the mapping of that, it was literally, instead of a shade of blue, almost the entire right side of his brain was black. And that showed advanced dementia. For a guy in his, I think 40s, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was like early 40s, he literally had the brain of a 79-year-old man in dementia. Kind of reminds me of somebody in office right now. But anyway, the point is that that's how advanced the CTE was. And that's alarming. Yeah. So I think Chris Nowinski's contributions really, I think, can't get overstated enough, because if it wasn't for that, you wouldn't be seeing the movement towards safer working, the idea of getting away from chair shots, maybe reckless styles, maybe being tailored a little bit,
Yeah.
I don't know. I think Chris Nowinski was a really good part of this documentary for sure.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I think we should stop right there and we can just pick up on the next time. So, Tyler, is there anything you want to put over before we go?
No, just like and share. We'll see you next time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Same thing. Fernando, is there anything you want to put over your show on Monday nights, all that stuff?
It's great to see you guys. I definitely want to come back, and obviously, let's continue the
always. You're welcome back. Yeah.
And also too, it's a good luck.
Well, you do two more. You do two more shows, and you're gonna have to be a part of the intro.
Oh, good luck to Tyler now in October. He's watching the Yankees go for a 28th World Series championship. We'll see, God willing.
I won't be watching.
As the Blue Jays continue to decide what uniform colors they select instead of looking at pennants. But again, folks, in all seriousness, check out Real Talk on Monday nights on the Jersey First Television Network. You can check out Facebook.com/Fernando Uribe Media /videos. You can also go to the Jersey First YouTube page, Jersey First TV /streams, and also on jerseyfirst.org/TV. Brand new episodes of Real Talk premiere every Monday. We have a lot of great guests coming up. We'll be talking about business. We'll be talking about mental health. We'll be talking about law enforcement, elections, that and much more, folks, every Monday night. Check your local listings for start times. We appreciate you tuning into Real Talk on Monday nights.
Yeah, thank you so much, Fernando, for coming on the show. It was an awesome conversation. Definitely loved having you. I'm so happy to welcome you back to the wrestling world. I know you've been MIA for a little bit. You've been very busy with the election and everything with Trump versus Harris and stuff like that. So I know that that's an exciting time for you as well. Again, Tyler, I'm glad that you're safe out there with Helene. I'm glad that you didn't have any damage out there. It's really good to know that everything's good. You're good there. So guys, thank you so much. Tune in next week. We will try to, we're not going to give you a specific day because we're going to be going by Fernando's schedule so we can finish up this episode. And then hopefully we can steal him. Maybe we might have to sign him to a contract like a blood oath or something. You never know. We'll have to do that. Cubans, Puerto Ricans, and we'll have to get the Cuban flag in here in our intro and stuff like that.
Cubans, Canadians, Puerto Ricans, and it's a UN theme here on this show.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. All inclusive. All right, guys. Thank you so much. We're out.
Later.